I can't remember. It's not changed, but I just don't remember what the date is. Sorry. What? October 24th. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start building the skin. And the skin is not a hard set of notes, but it does have some interesting stuff that you may not have been exposed to in it. So we are going to be working on the epidermis today, and then we'll be doing the rest of the epidermis and the dermis next time. So before we go any further, I just want you to note big picture, the orientation and the relationship between the epidermis and the dermis. And I know you know, and I've made you say it before, but I'm going to do it again. What kind of tissue is the epidermis made of? Keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. And the dermis is? Areolar and dense. It's mostly dense irregular, so sometimes people skip the areolar, but it is both. So please note the thickness of them relative to one another. Even the thickest epidermis is way, way thinner than the dermis. Okay, so we're going to do the epidermis today, and the way that we are going to do the epidermis is to teach it the way that it's built. And the way that it is built is from the bottom to the top. Okay, so this is just looking at the epidermis, and this is an actual histology slide of the epidermis. And so please note that there are multiple strata. After you leave the dermis, which we're not going to be interested in yet, we have these strata, Stratum Basale all the way up to Stratum Corneum. Strata is Latin for layers. Singular for strata is stratum. Okay, so these are basically the layers. Okay, so we're going to start down at the bottom, and the reason we're going to start down at the bottom is that the epidermis is formed from the bottom to the top. The cells that are most active in cell division are down here at the bottom, and then as they undergo cell division, the older cells are pushed up as the newer cells stay to the bottom. And then this one undergoes cell division again, the older cells are pushed up as the newer cells stay at the bottom. Does that make sense? Okay, so this entire process, by the time you go from the bottom to the top of the epidermis, is about a 30-day turnover. You get a whole new epidermis about every 30 days, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. So we're going to start down here. This bottom layer is called the Stratum Basale. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to why it's called that? Bottom. It's at the basal surface, right, of the skin, okay? And the cells within the Stratum Basale are either called keratinocytes, because eventually they'll start producing keratin, or basal cells. So let's start talking about those. Okay, so the Stratum Basale is the deepest layer of the epidermis. It is, of course, going to be attached to the dermis by what? The dermis is the connective tissue. How do you stick the connective tissue? Yeah, the basement membrane, exactly. It's going to be attached via the basement membrane plus some hemidesmosomes every once in a while. And what it is composed of is a single cell of mostly these basal cells. There's a couple other kind of cells in there we'll talk about in a minute. And these basal cells are, they don't look squamous, of course. The tissue is called stratified squamous because of the shape of the cells at the top, right? Down here they look more columnar maybe? I don't know. You don't call them columnar, but that's what they look like. So their basal cells are keratinocytes. And what these are going to do is they are undergoing continuous cell division. And as they undergo continuous cell division, old cells get pushed to the top and the new cells are at the bottom. And in addition, they behave as a cohort. And by cohort, I mean that they are formed all at relatively the same time, and then they move up at relatively the same time. Although they can still undergo cell division when they're up here, they're most active in cell division down here. And the other important thing is that when they are formed as a cohort, they are generally stuck together with the tightest of the cell junctions, which is what? The tightest. Well, I'm sorry, the strongest. Sorry, I didn't mean to mislead you. The strongest of the cell junctions, which are desmosomes, exactly. So keep that in mind for just a second. It'll become relevant. Okay, so let's just, before we get into all of the rest of the layers, let's just acknowledge what tends to happen as you age. So exfoliation is happening to all of us, right? You just rub up against things and you knock off some dead skin cells. And cell division is happening in all of us. One of those two is a mechanical activity, and the rate doesn't change as you age. But the other one is a cellular activity, and it does change as you age. So what happens as you age is exfoliation stays at about the same rate, but cell division slows. And when that occurs, what tends to happen slowly but surely to the thickness of the epidermis? It thins and thins and thins. And if you've ever worked with very, very elderly people, their skin is paper thin, really easy to rip accidentally. So that will happen as you age. So as the cells are pushed up, eventually they are going to start producing keratin. That happens right about here. We'll talk about that later. And then after they've done their protein production, then the cells, the organelles will die off, and then basically they're just going to be a bag filled with waterproofing protein, right? Up here they're no longer alive, okay? So that process takes about 30 days to go from the bottom of the epidermis to the top of the epidermis, and you shed your skin all the time. You shed about 18 pounds of skin during a lifetime, and most of it's in your house. Super grody. Especially if you live with roommates and you're like, oh, that is so not okay. So it's all like in your house, about 18 pounds of skin shed in your lifetime. And you shed it constantly. So before, when I was in grad school, to put myself through grad school, I worked in a DNA fingerprinting lab. And if I have enough money and a little bit of time, I could find DNA every single place that you went all day long. So you were constantly dropping skin cells everywhere. You touch the desk, you leave some skin cells behind. Your clothes have tons of skin cells on the inside of them. So you're constantly just dropping it off everywhere. Okay, so let's talk about dandruff. So what is dandruff? Dandruff doesn't really have anything to do, just so you know, with hygiene. It has to do with the rate of keratinization and exfoliation. Some people's rate of keratinization and exfoliation is 2 to 3 times the normal rate, which means they are going to have a lot of skin sloughing off. So that's what dandruff is. It can be exacerbated by hygiene situations, but it's not usually caused by hygiene situations. And so the dandruff shampoos, the ones that do that, what they do is when they're wet, they're super exfoliating to get all the loose stuff off. But when they dry, they just keep it stuck to your head till the next time you wash your hair. Because, you know, those of us with dark hair who wear dark clothes all the time, dandruff will really show when it starts to actually exfoliate. But it's not as gross as people think it is. Okay, so the keratinocytes, as I mentioned, are held together laterally by desmosomes. And that means that as they are sloughed off, just so you know, as they move to the surface, because they have desmosomes all connecting them, you don't usually slough them off in individual cells. So when you, for instance, your skin, you can actually scratch your skin, and you can see skin cells sloughing off, but you can't see an individual cell. What you're actually seeing is a collection of about hundreds of skin cells that didn't all let go of each other, right? Okay, but if you damage them all at one time, like with a sunburn, if you damage them all at one time, like with a sunburn, then what happens is they're all going to move up as a cohort much faster than 30 days, and there's hardly any time for their desmosomes to break, and then you can peel them off in one big sheet, right? That's like indication that the desmosomes were there, okay? We'll talk about sun tans and sunburns today too. Okay, so let's talk about the first of the skin cancers. We're going to talk about the 3 major types of skin cancers as we move here. The first of the skin cancers occurs in these keratinocytes or basal cells, and it's called basal cell carcinoma. And it's actually a relatively common skin cancer. And it's probably not going to be surprising to you that it's relatively common because those cells undergo really fast cell division, and then the stats are just kind of against you. If you are undergoing really fast cell division, then it's more likely over time that you're going to lose control of your cell division. So basal cell carcinoma, let me show you. The picture that your textbook has of it is late stage basal cell carcinoma, and here's what it looks like late stage. But it's not like you wouldn't notice that. That looks like somebody melted a chocolate chip on your skin. That does not look healthy, does it? But it doesn't look like that in the early stages, and I think it's far more useful to look at basal cell carcinoma when it looks like in the early stages. And this is what it looks like in the early stages. It's shiny and it's dome-shaped. And if you're Caucasian, especially if you have a lot of like red pigments in your skin, then sometimes it's like red. But in a lot of us who don't have a lot of red pigments in our skin, it would be shiny and dome-shaped in whatever color your skin is. Does that make sense? So this doesn't look as problematic as the other one, right? So what a lot of times people think it is, it's some kind of bump or zit that just won't go away. It's like the 2-year zit, okay? So basal cell carcinoma, of the 3 types of skin cancer, is the least likely to metastasize quickly. Now, does that mean it can't kill you? No. It means that it won't kill you as quickly as, for instance, melanoma. You guys know what metastasis means? when a cancer starts in one location and moves and starts causing a cancer in another location. So this, of the three, is the least likely to metastasize. Generally, you get full cure by surgical excision in about 99% of cases with this particular skin cancer. So where do people get it? Well, people tend to get it wherever they're exposed to the most UV radiation, because we'll see the relationship between UV radiation and cancers today. So if you are male in this country, you tend to be more likely to get it on your face, on the back of your neck, the back of your ears, and if you're bald, you get it on top of your head. And then males, a lot of times, will get them on their hands as well, because that's where you get a lot of UV radiation exposure. If you're female, you have slightly different patterns where people get it. Women usually will wear a little bit of makeup, and or they'll protect their skin with sunscreen, because we may not be concerned about cancer, but we're concerned about ugly, right? Ugly is equal opportunity, right? So you got a little sunscreen, and so less likely to get it on your face, less likely to get it on your lips than men are, because we tend to protect our lips with something. Our hair tends to be a little longer, so not quite as often back here, but we do tend to get it here. We don't protect our hands well enough from the sun, and they're typically exposed. And here is the big one for women. If I could go back and redo my 20s, I promise you I would be wearing sunscreen here, because it shows your age and it starts to have all of these sun damages. And the other place that women get it, although not as frequently here in Utah because we tend to be dressed far more conservatively than the rest of the country, is the backs of our legs. Because when we're, A, wear shorts, and B, you don't look back there very often after a certain age because you're just like, whatever. I don't even want to see it anymore. It looks like my mom back there. So, so backs of our legs, and we don't tend to get them checked very frequently. So that's true for all three types of skin cancer. And we'll get to all three of them maybe today or maybe tomorrow. Okay, so now one other thing that's present there, there's actually two other things that are present there, and that is, note this little guy right here. Do you see that guy? The little blue cell. That's called a Merkel cell or a tactile cell, and this is kind of interesting. That's actually the most superficial of the sensory receptors, which means that you have absolutely zero capacity for sensation in the vast majority of your epidermis. Only in the deepest layer of your epidermis do you have this tactile cell. And remember also that the epidermis is also avascular, so you don't have any blood vessels in there. So with no nerves and no blood vessels, did anybody but me do this? Everybody acts like I'm crazy when I talk about this. When I was a kid, my brother and I pretty much professionally tortured one another, constantly. So we would stick straight pins in our fingers. As long as you don't stick them too deep, it doesn't hurt, right? You can go around like torture your siblings, no? No, as long as you, what? And you stitch your, all right. I didn't have video games back then, just so you know. There was only Pong. So as long as you don't go to the deepest layer of the epidermis, you don't feel a damn thing, and you never bleed unless you get all the way to the dermis. Do any of you guys do that besides me? Thank you. Do you guys do it to each other? What? Every. Oh, because you always have pins with you. Oh, no, you did it too. All three of you who wear this job are like, oh yeah, I've done that. Totally. That's awesome. Can you guys pick locks too? Almost? I want to learn that skill. Okay. All right. So anyway, that's why. That's why you can do that. It's Freddy Krueger. That's what I pretended who I was when I was a kid. Okay. So now let's get to the other kind of cells. Do you see this cell right here? This one? It also doesn't, it's not just in the basal, in the stratum basale, it also goes up a little bit. These guys, this is not one, but this guy right here and this guy right here, those are called melanocytes. To me, they look kind of like Oogie Boogie from Nightmare Before Christmas, right? No, they don't? No? I like him. So I want to talk about melanocytes, and melanocytes are pretty fascinating. Melanocytes make melanin, which is one of the three pigments that's responsible for skin color. And skin color is a fascinating topic to talk about to me. Maybe not to you, but I want to talk about it anyway. Skin color is not simply dark versus light, but let's talk about melanin first. Melanin is a brown, yellow-brown, or black pigment that is produced by these melanocytes. And its function is pretty damn phenomenal. What its function is to protect your DNA from known mutagens. And a mutagen is something that will mutate your DNA. Here's the problem with mutating your DNA, among other things. Your DNA is in control of your cell cycle, okay? You mutate your DNA, you can lose control of your cell cycle, which can lead to what? Cancer, exactly. So mutagens are generally carcinogens, okay? So how does this protect you? So I've got my little Ooga Booga cell right here, right? Oogie Boogie. And Oogie Boogie is going to make me a brown, yellow, brown, or black pigment. It's going to make it in vesicles, but the vesicles don't all stay in there. They actually dump them out into the tissue around. So not only am I protecting my nucleus, I'm also protecting the nuclei around me, okay? And so what you're going to end up with is this. Do you see this guy right here? Okay, so why is that a big deal? The big deal is that having brown pigments protects you from UV radiation the same way it does when you put on a brown shirt or a black shirt. It bounces the UV radiation off, and therefore it protects the cells and protects the tissues. Does that make sense to you guys? Okay, so some people, generally genetically predisposed, are going to have a predisposition to, we all have about the same number of melanocytes, but we don't have the same production of melanin. So some people are genetically predisposed to have a pretty rapid rate of melanin production and pretty persistent melanin, meaning once you make it, it stays around. Does that make sense? Okay, and I'm not talking about tanning yet. I'm talking about your inherent rate, like what color you are at 4 months old when you haven't been exposed to much sun, right? Okay, so that's sort of the difference between us. But then let's acknowledge that we are not simply black versus white. That's not how skin color goes. There is tremendous variability in skin color. This isn't even all of it, of course, because you can get more variability than that. But before we continue with melanin, there are two other pigments that are responsible for the color of your skin and your hair and your eyes. And the other two pigments are a pigment called carotene. And carotene is yellow. And depending on how much carotene you have in your skin, you may describe your skin as olive, right? And for those of us with olive skin, I have olive skin. You have olive skin. You can look around and see who has olive skin. You can always tell when you got olive skin because when you're sick, you look like freaking death. You look green. It's terrible, okay? So that pigment is with also the melanin, and then the other pigment is the hemoglobin in your capillaries. If you have your capillaries that are relatively close to the surface, your skin has a pinkish hue to it. And then you're going to be the combination of these three colors, right? So there's tremendous color variation in skin all through the world. Okay, so let's go back to melanin for just a second and talk about it. So we all have the same relative number of melanocytes, so the difference in skin color are primarily due to production and persistence of melanin. The function of melanin is to shield the epidermis and the dermis and the nuclei of the cells from UV damage. So I think we mentioned this last time, but let's talk about it again. Because of the function of melanin, we can appreciate the fact that people who are most susceptible to all forms of skin cancer, what can you say about their skin? It's lighter in color, exactly. If you combine that with living here in Utah, which is where we have relatively little protection from the skin because the atmosphere is a little bit thinner here. And also here in Utah, there's a tremendous, there historically was a tremendous influx of people from Scandinavian genetics. The rate of skin cancer here in Utah is very high compared to most places in the world. So you have a less protection from UV radiation when you have less melanin in your skin. So let's look at what that ends up saying, the evolutionary sort of story about that. It's kind of interesting. So here's a skin color map around the world. So if you look close to the equator where the sun hits the earth most directly, right? You're going to get the strongest, most intense UV radiation. Then you can see that the predisposition to dark skin color corresponds with equatorial regions of the world. And then as you move further away, you can see the skin start to get lighter. Well, all indications, even a study that was put out last week, are that the entire human population came out of Central Africa about 50 to 80,000 years ago. They started to move to other regions. So what we couldn't answer for a really, really long time has to do with why the evolutionary pressure seemed to be that the skin should be lighter as you move further away from the equator. But they actually figured out a hypothesis to test, and it's tested out pretty well. And that is that as you move further away from the equator, then dark skin, although it's not as necessary to protect from UV radiation, there is a selective disadvantage to having dark skin further away from the equator, and it has to do with vitamin D production. Okay, you guys with me? So if you move further away from the equator, so let's say we have someone from Central Africa from very, very dark skin that moves to Greenland, right? Okay, what's the problem? The problem seemed to be when we had immigrants that were moving from the equatorial regions to really northern and southern hemisphere regions, is that their vitamin D level dropped really dramatically and you started having bone density problems. Does that make sense to you? Because you've got so much protection from UV radiation that the little amount of UV that's available does not actually have adequate vitamin D production. Does that make sense? So I will tell you that just being here in Utah, do you guys know that about 90% of us are vitamin D deficient in the middle of winter? Yeah, we have vitamin D problems. And if you were dark-skinned, you were going to have worse vitamin D problems. So most of us should be supplementing with vitamin D, or at least talking to our doctors about supplementing with vitamin D in the middle of the winter. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting story. Different selective advantage as you move to different regions. Now, this is probably going to change pretty dramatically over the next 100 years because we're very mobile, right? So what you're probably going to end up with is the whole thing's going to look vaguely beige, right? Maybe slightly darker at the equator and lighter at the edges, but there's going to just be a lot of populations moving pretty much everywhere. But it's kind of interesting. There's a NASA map that I forgot to bring up that directly corresponds to this, that shows the UV exposure in different parts of the world, and you overlay it there and you can just see exactly how this came about. Anyway, okay, so clinical notes. So what if you can't produce melanin? If you can't produce melanin genetically, then you have a genetic disorder called albinism. And albinism is genetically one of the genes for producing melanin or more is mutated and you can't produce it adequately. You're going to be born with albinism if you have albinism. And this little boy has albinism of the skin and the hair and partial albinism of the eyes. Your eye color is a result of melanin and a couple of other pigments. So this is albinism in a person who probably has genetically dark skin. This is albinism in a person who has genetically light skin. Okay, albinism of the skin, hair, and eyes. So what do you guys think about the predisposition to skin cancer in people with albinism? Very, incredibly high. You have to protect your skin all the time. In addition, losing the pigment in your eye also increases UV damage in your eyes. And not only do they have high incidence of loss of vision, they also have eye cancers that you won't see in other people. Fascinatingly, did you know that people with lighter eyes are susceptible to more UV damage throughout their entire lives? So people with very, very light eyes, as they age, tend to have more UV damage. So you should invest in some good sunglasses if you are one of those really light blue-eyed people. So yeah, people with darker eyes and darker hair tend to have better protection, head and eyes. This is albinism of the eyes. With this one, if you've ever wondered why the eyes of people with albinism look pink, it's because with all of the pigments gone, all you can see is the capillaries that are in the eyes. That's all you're seeing is the blood flow through the eyes. So you've got blood flow running through the eyes. What? What? Oh, well, you're seeing the back of the eye, so the pupil as a whole, and you're seeing the retina with a tremendous blood flow going through it. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, so how about vitiligo? I don't know if you've ever heard of vitiligo. Vitiligo is not a genetic disorder, it's an autoimmune disorder. So what happens is your immune system starts to, for whatever reason, attack the melanocytes, and destroy melanocytes, which makes you have a patchy loss of pigmentation. And sometimes it's a roving patchy loss of pigmentation. And so these guys, this is a person with inherently medium pigment skin, and this is a person with inherently dark skin. And obviously, it's more obvious when your skin is inherently dark than it is when your skin is not. But it affects pretty much every color of skin. You just don't necessarily notice it quite as much. So this is vitiligo. There's no cure for it. There's no cure for any autoimmune disease. Was that your question?
No, I was just wondering if there's something, you said it was pathological?
Autoimmune.
Autoimmune.
Yeah.
Because when I was young, when I first got my first shots, they gave me a shot in the leg, and I have that in that spot where I got.
Oh, that's fascinating. Your immune system came to that particular area. Ah. Well, Michael Jackson says that he had vitiligo, and he may have had vitiligo, but vitiligo does not bleach you evenly so that it completely changes your entire skin color. So if he had vitiligo, he also had very expensive treatments after the vitiligo, so that made him completely bleached. So this is vitiligo in a girl of African descent, and this is vitiligo in the later stages in a girl of African descent. They do have increased risk of skin cancer because they stop with the melanin production. I wish I'd remembered. Hold on just a second. Oh, since we have a minute, I'll show you. There's one of the America's Next Top Models. I want to show you a picture of a model. She has it. She's so freaking amazing looking. I'll show you a picture of her. This is Wini Harlow. Hold on, let me get it. This is Wini Harlow, who won America's Next Top Model. And she has vitiligo, almost symmetrically on both sides. Have you seen her before? It's pretty awesome. It makes me think that my skin's really boring. I know, it's pretty awesome. I thought it was kind of cool. So anyway, yeah, she won America's Next Top Model, and she just rocks it. She's like, oh yeah, you all want this, don't you? You don't. But, okay, so let's talk about suntans and sunburns and freckles. Okay, so here is what a suntan is, guys. When you start exposing your body to UV radiation to the point that your body gets concerned, what's wrong is you make your melanocytes cry, and they're actually trying to keep up with your UV exposure by increasing melanin production. And what they're really trying to do is to keep you from damaging your DNA. Tanning, not something that is beneficial to you. I mean, it's just not good for you, especially not here. We have very little UV protection. And I did it. I was from the generation in which we just slathered baby oil on ourselves and like laid on the roof. There was not even any sunscreen in it. It's just like, oh yeah, and that's where this wrinkle and that one, that one came from. So suntan is an increased production of melanin in response to UV rays, and it's an attempt to protect your DNA from damage. If you can't protect your DNA from damage, you are going to get a sunburn. And depending on how bad the sunburn is, you know that if you have a sunburn, you have actually overwhelmed the melanin's capacity. So did you guys know that if you have 2 blistering sunburns in your life, you have increased your lifetime risk of skin cancers by 400%? You have to be very careful with your children's exposure too. And it's even worse when you get sunburned young because your cells are more active. What? You just be careful now. You just be careful. Okay, hold on just a second. What are freckles? Freckles are an inherited uneven deposition of melanocytes. So instead of having melanocytes sort of evenly deposited throughout your stratum basale, you inherited a patchy deposition of melanocytes, which means whenever you get exposed to UV radiation, you're going to produce little spots. Not really. They're inherited. They're dominant too. Go ahead.
So with freckles, at least with the freckles I used to have, they definitely decreased over the years. What causes that decrease?
You actually produce less pigment as you age. All of our skins will get slightly lighter as we age. Go ahead.
So with this suntan thing, if like someone who doesn't burn very easily, does that just mean that their melanocytes are like
It means that they're usually able to keep up with the job, but just because you're not burning does not mean you're not destroying your collagen. So ugly is equal opportunity. It's truly, do you get, hold, just wait right there. Just since we're talking about this, and since these people have still not ruined their skin yet, just let me show you something. We will talk about skin and aging, but let me show you this truck driver. Okay, this is a truck driver. What do you think the difference is between one side of his skin and the other?
That's where the window was.
There you go. Yep. I mean, because this is like the best controlled experiment ever, right? Because he has exactly the same genetics as the other side of his head, exactly the same diet, exactly the same environment. The difference is sun exposure right there. So he may not get cancer, but he definitely got the Uggs, right? Okay, so go ahead.
If you put on sunscreen and you still burn, no matter what you do, does that mean that you're just not producing a lot of?
You're not producing a lot of melanin.
Stay inside.
Yeah, stay inside. Or just make sure that you have a really good life up until like 35. Like all of those things that you wanted to do on your bucket list, start working on them. Just kidding. No, it's not that bad. I mean, the stats are not incredibly high, but the type of cancer that we're going to talk about next, which we'll do next time, is melanoma, which is the most malignant of the skin cancers. Go ahead.
So you're talking about like melanin in your eye.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom, my grandma has like a thick layer of blue around her eye.
Ooh, interesting.
So is that like the loss?
No, it's an area where so everybody has blue eyes, just so you know. All of us do. All of us do. Blue, I mean, unless you've got albinism. What I have, for instance, is a layer of carotene and a little bit of melanin on top, which makes my eyes green, hazel. And if you have a whole bunch of melanin on top, you don't see any of the blue at all. So what probably happens here is that they have melanin production in one area of the eyes and not in the other. It's cool, yeah.
What causes like color change in eyes?
They don't actually change colors. They reflect colors very differently based on what you're actually around and exposed to. My eyes look very different colors, but you can do that with makeup too, right? If you like if you got green eyes and you put on purple makeup, they all of a sudden look super green, but they're not actually any different colors. So it doesn't change the production of anything on that.
So when people have two different color eyes, they just
That's called heterochromia, and it means that although their genetics were the same, the actual production of the proteins was different on one side than the other. Yeah, and that's kind of cool. You can also have that in little spots in your eyes too. Okay, we'll do melanoma next time. Take this, put it in your head.